History of the World by J. M. Roberts. Book 6 The Great Acceleration. Chapter 3 Political Change A New Europe. There were some genuinely popular risings in 1848. In Italy, they were usually revolts of townsmen rather than peasants. The Lombard peasants indeed cheered the Austrian army when it returned, because they saw no good for them in a revolution led by aristocrats who were their landlords. In parts of Germany, over much of which the traditional structures of landed rural society remained intact, the peasants behaved as their predecessors had done in France in 1789, burning their landlords' houses not merely through personal animus, but in order to destroy the hated and feared records of rents, dues, and labor services. Such outbreaks frightened urban liberals as much as the Parisian outbreak of despair and unemployment in the June days frightened the middle classes in France. There, because the peasant was since 1789, speaking broadly, a conservative, the government was assured of the support of the provinces in crushing the Parisian poor, who had given radicalism its brief success. But conservatism could be found within revolutionary movements too. German working class turbulence alarmed the better off, but this was because the leaders of German workers talked of socialism while actually seeking a return to the past. They had the safe world of guilds and apprenticeships in mind and feared machinery in factories, steamboats on the Rhine, which put boatmen out of work, the opening of unrestricted entry to trades, in short, the all too evident signs of the onset of market society. Almost always, liberalism's lack of appeal to the masses was shown up in 1848 by popular revolution. Altogether, the social importance of 1848 is as complex and escapes easy generalization as much as its political content. It was probably in the countryside of Eastern and Central Europe that the revolutions changed society most. There, liberal principles and the fear of popular revolt went hand in hand to impose change on the landlords. Wherever outside Russia, obligatory peasant labor and bondage to the soil survived. It was abolished as a result of 1848. That year carried the Rural Social Revolution, launched 60 years earlier in France, to its conclusion in Central and most of Eastern Europe. The way was now open for the reconstruction of agricultural life in Germany and the Danube Valley on individualist and market lines. Though many of its practices and habits of mind were still to linger, feudal society was in effect now coming to an end all over Europe. The political components of French revolutionary principles, though, would have to wait longer for their expression. In the case of nationalism, this was not very long. A dispute over Russian influence in the Near East in 1854 ended the long peace between the great powers which had lasted since 1815. The Crimean War, in which the French and British fought as allies of the Ottoman Sultan against the Russians, was in many ways a notable struggle. Fighting took place in the Baltic, in the southern Russia, and in the Crimea, the last theater attracting most attention. There, the Allies had set themselves to capture Sebastopol, the naval base which was the key to Russian power in the Black Sea. Some of the results were surprising. The British Army fought gallantly, as did its opponents and allies, but was specially distinguished by the inadequacy of the administrative arrangements. The scandal these caused launched an important wave of radical reform at home. Incidentally, the war also helped to found the prestige of a new profession for women, that of nursing, for the collapse of British medical services had been particularly striking. Florence Nightingale's work launched the first major extension of the occupational opportunities available to the respectable women since the creation of female religious communities in the Dark Ages. The conduct of the war is also noteworthy in another way as an index of modernity. It was the first between major powers in which steamships and a railway were employed, and it brought the electric telegraph cable to Istanbul. Some of these things were portentous, yet they mattered less in the short run than what the war did to international relations. Russia was defeated, and her long enjoyment of a power to intimidate Turkey was bridled for a time. A step was taken towards the establishment of another new Christian nation, Romania, which was finally brought about in 1862. Once more, nationality triumphed in former Ottoman lands, but the crucial effect of the war was that the Holy Alliance had disappeared. The old rivalry of the 18th century between Austria and Russia over what would have happened to the Ottoman inheritance in the Balkans had broken out again when Austria warned Russia not to occupy the Danube principalities, as the future Romania was termed, during the war and then occupied them herself. This was 5 years after Russia had intervened to restore Habsburg power by crushing the Hungarian Revolution. It was the end of a friendship between the two powers. The next time Austria faced a threat, she would have to do so without the Russian policemen of conservative Europe at her side. In 1856, when peace was made, few people can have anticipated how quickly that time would come. Within 10 years, Austria lost in two short, sharp wars her hegemony, both in Italy and in Germany, and those countries were united in new national states. Nationalism was indeed triumphed, and at the cost of the Habsburgs, as had been prophesied by enthusiasts in 1848, but in a totally unexpected way. Not revolution, but the ambitions of two traditionally expansive monarchical states, Sardinia and Prussia, had led each to set about improving its position at the expense of Austria, whose isolation was at that moment complete. Not only had she sacrificed the Russian alliance, but after 1852, France was ruled by an emperor who again bore the name Napoleon. He was the nephew of the first to do so. He had been elected president of the Second Republic, whose constitution he then set aside by coup d'etat. The name Napoleon was itself terrifying. It suggested a program of international reconstruction or revolution. Napoleon III, the second, was a legal fiction, a son of Napoleon I, who had never ruled, stood for the destruction of the anti-French settlement of 1815 and therefore of the Austrian predominance which propped it up in Italy and Germany. He talked the language of nationalism with less ambition than most rulers and seems to have believed in it. With arms and diplomacy, he forwarded the work of two great diplomatic technicians, Cavour and Bismarck, the prime ministers respectively of Sardinia and of Prussia. In 1859, Sardinia and France fought Austria. After a brief war, the Austrians were left with only Venetia in Italy. Cavour now set to work to incorporate other Italian states into Sardinia, a part of the price being that Sardinian Savoy had to be given to France. Cavour died in 1861, and debate still continues over what was the real extent of his aims. But by 1871, his successors had produced a united Italy under the former King of Sardinia, who was thus recompensed for the loss of Savoy, the ancestral duchy of his house. In that year, Germany was united too. Bismarck had begun by rallying German liberal sentiment to the Prussian cause. once again in a nasty little war against Denmark in 1864. 2 years later, Prussia defeated Austria in a lightning campaign in Bohemia, thus at last ending the Hohenzollern Habsburg duel for the supremacy in Germany, begun in 1740 by Frederick II. The war which did this was rather a registration of an accomplished fact than its achievement, for since 1848, Austria had been much weakened in German affairs. In that year, German liberals had offered a German crown, not to the emperor but to the king of Prussia. Nevertheless, some states had still looked to Vienna for leadership and patronage, and they were now left alone to meet Prussian bullying. The Habsburg Empire now became wholly Danubian, its foreign policy preoccupied with Southeast Europe and the Balkans. It had retired from the Netherlands in 1815. Venetia had been extracted by the Prussians for the Italians in 1866, and now it left Germany to its own devices too. Immediately after the peace, the Hungarians seized the opportunity to inflict a further defeat on the humiliated monarchy by obtaining a virtual autonomy for the half of the Habsburg monarchy, made up of the lands of the Hungarian crown. The empire thus became, in 1867, the dual or Austro Hungarian monarchy, divided rather untidily into two halves, linked by little more than the dynasty itself and the conduct of a common foreign policy. German unification required one further step. It had gradually dawned on France that the assertion of Prussian power beyond the Rhine was not in the French interest. Instead of a disputed Germany, she now faced one dominated by an important military power. The Richelieu era had crumbled away unnoticed. Bismarck used this new awareness, together with Napoleon III's weaknesses at home and international isolation, to provoke France into a foolish declaration of war in 1870. Victory in this war set the coping stone on the new edifice of German nationality, for Prussia had taken the lead in defending Germany against France, and there were still Germans alive who could remember what French armies had done in Germany under an earlier Napoleon. The Prussian army destroyed the Second Empire in France. It was to be the last monarchical regime in that country and created the German Empire, the Second Reich, as it was called, to distinguish it from the medieval empire. In practice, it was a Prussian domination cloaked in federal forms, but as a German national state, it satisfied many German liberals. It was dramatically and appropriately founded in 1871, when the King of Prussia accepted the crown of United Germany, which his predecessor had refused to take from German liberals in 1848 from his fellow princes in the palace of Louis XIV at Versailles. There had been, thus, in 50 years, a revolution in international affairs, and it would have great consequences for world as well as European history. Germany had replaced France as the dominant land power in Europe, as France had replaced Spain in the 17th century. This fact was to overshadow Europe's international relations until they ceased to be determined by forces originating within her. It owed just a little to revolutionary politics in the narrow and strict sense. The conscious revolutionaries of the 19th century had achieved nothing comparable with the work of Cavour, Bismarck, and half in spite of himself, Napoleon III. This was very odd, given the hopes entertained of revolution in this period, and the fears felt for it. Revolution had achieved little except at the fringes of Europe and had even begun to show signs of flagging. Down to 1848, there had been plenty of revolutions, to say nothing of plots, conspiracies, and Ziemiantos, which did not justify the name. After 1848, there were very few. Another Polish Revolution took place in 1863, but this was the only outbreak of note in the lands of the great powers until 1871. An ebbing of revolutionary effort by then is understandable. Revolutions seemed to have achieved little outside France and had there brought disillusion and dictatorship. Some of their goals were being achieved in other ways. Cavour and his followers had created a united Italy after all, greatly to the chagrin of Mazzini, since it was not one of which that revolutionary could approve. And Bismarck had done what many of the German liberals of 1848 had hoped for by providing a Germany which was indisputably a great power. Other ends were being achieved by economic progress. For all the horrors of the poverty which it contained, 19th century Europe was getting richer and was giving more and more of its peoples a larger share of its wealth. Even quite short term factors helped here. The year 1848 was soon followed by the great gold discoveries of California, which provided a flow of bullion to stimulate the world economy in 1850s and 1860s. Confidence grew and unemployment fell in these decades, and this was good for social peace. A more fundamental reason why revolutions were less frequent was perhaps that they became more difficult to carry out. Governments were finding it steadily easier to grapple with them, largely for technical reasons. The 19th century created modern police forces, better communications by rail and telegraph gave new power to central government in dealing with distant revolt. Above all, armies had a growing technical superiority to rebellion. As early as 1795, a French government showed that once it had control of the regular armed forces and was prepared to use them, it could master Paris. During the long peace from 1815 to 1848, many European armies, in fact, became much more instruments of security directed potentially against their own populations than means of international competition directed against foreign enemies. It was only the defection of important sections of the armed forces which permitted successful revolution in Paris in 1830 and 1848. Once such force Once such forces were available to the government, battles like that of the June days of 1848, which one observer called the greatest slave war in history, could only end with the defeat of the rebels. From that year, indeed, no popular revolution was ever to succeed in a major European country against a government whose control of its armed forces was unshaken by defeat in war or by subversion, and which was determined to use its power. This was vividly and bloodily demonstrated in 1871 when a rebellious Paris was once again crushed by a French government in little more than a week, with a toll of dead as great as that exacted by the terror of 1793 to 1794. A popular regime which drew to itself a wide range of radicals and reformers set itself up in the capital as the Commune of Paris, a name evocative of traditions of municipal independence going back to the Middle Ages, and more important, to 1793, when the Commune or City Council of Paris had been the center of revolutionary fervor. The Commune of 1871 was able to take power because, in the aftermath of defeat by the Germans, the government could not disarm the capital of the weapons with which it had successfully withstood a siege, and because the same defeat had inflamed many Parisians against the government, they believed to have let them down. During its brief life, there were a few weeks of quiet while the government prepared its riposte. The commune did very little. but it produced a lot of left wing rhetoric and was seen as the embodiment of social revolution. This gave additional bitterness to the efforts to suppress it. They came when the government had reassembled its forces from returning prisoners of war to reconquer Paris, which became the scene of brief but bloody street fighting. Once again, regularly constituted armed forces overcame workmen and shopkeepers, manning hastily impoverished barricades. If anything could do so, the ghastly failure of the Paris Commune should have killed the revolutionary myth, both in its power to terrify and its power to inspire. Yet it did not. If anything, it strengthened it. Conservatives found it a great standby to have the commune example to hand in evoking the dangers lurking always ready to burst out from under the surface of society. Revolutionaries had a new episode of heroism and martyrdom to add to an apostolic succession of revolutionaries running already from 1789 to 1848. But the Commune also revived the revolutionary mythology because of a new factor whose importance had already struck both left and right. This was socialism. This word, like its relative, socialist, has come to encompass a great many different things and did so almost from the start. Both words were first commonly used in France around about 1830 to describe theories and men opposed to a society run on market principles and to an economy operated on laissez-faire lines, of which the main beneficiaries, they thought, were the wealthy. Economic and social egalitarianism is fundamental to the socialist idea. Most socialists have been able to agree on that. They have usually believed that in a good society, there would be no classes oppressing one another through the advantages given to one by the ownership of wealth. All socialists, too, could agree that there was nothing sacred about property, whose rights buttressed injustice. Some sought to compete some sought to complete abolition and were called communists. Property is theft was one very successful slogan. Such ideas might be frightening, but were not very novel. Egalitarian ideas have fascinated men throughout history, and the Christian rulers of Europe had managed without difficulty to reconcile social arrangements, resting on sharp contrasts of wealth with the practice of a religion, one of whose greatest hymns praised God for filling the hungry with good things and sending the rich away empty. What happened in the early 19th century was that such ideas seemed to become at once more dangerous, linked to the idea of revolution in a new style, and more widespread. There was also a need for new thinking because of other developments. One was that the successful liberal political reform appeared to show that legal equality was not enough if it was deprived of content by dependence on the economically powerful or denatured by poverty and attendant ignorance. Another was that already in the 18th century, a few thinkers had seen big discrepancies of wealth as irrationalities in a world which could and should, they thought, be regulated to produce the greatest good of the greatest number. In the French Revolution, some thinkers and agitators already pressed forward demands in which later generations would see socialist ideas. Egalitarian ideas, nonetheless, only became socialism in a modern sense when they began to grapple with the problems of the new epoch of economic and social change, above all, with those presented by industrialization. This often required a great perspicacity, for these changes were very slow in making their impact outside Great Britain and Belgium, the first continental country to be industrialized in the same degree. Yet perhaps because the contrast they presented with traditional society was so stark, even the small beginnings of concentration in capitalist finance and manufacturing were remarked. One of the first men to grasp their potentially very great implications for social organization was a French nobleman, Claude Saint Simon. His seminal contribution to socialist thought was to consider the impact on society of technological and scientific advance. Saint Simon thought that they not only made planned organization of the economy imperative, but implied, indeed demanded, the replacement of the traditional ruling classes, aristocratic and rural in their outlook, by elites representing new economic and intellectual forces. Such ideas influenced many thinkers, most of them French, who in the 1830s advocated greater egalitarianism. They seemed to show that on rational as well as ethical grounds, such change was desirable. Their doctrines made enough impact and their considerations were enough talked about to terrify the French possessing classes in 1848, who thought they saw in the June days a socialist revolution. Socialists identified themselves for the most part with the tradition of the French Revolution, picturing the realization of their ideals as its next phase. So the misinterpretation is understandable. In 1848, at this juncture, there appeared a pamphlet which is the most important document in the history of socialism. It is always known as the Communist Manifesto, though this was not the title under which it was published. It was largely the work of a young German of Jewish birth, though himself baptized, Karl Marx, and with it, the point is reached at which the prehistory of socialism can be separated from its history. Marx proclaimed a complete break with what he called the utopian socialism of his predecessors. Utopian socialists attacked industrial capitalism because they thought it was unjust. Marx thought this beside the point. Nothing, according to Marx, could be hoped for from arguments to persuade people that change was morally desirable. Everything depended on the way history was going towards the actual and inevitable creation of a new working class by industrial society. The rootless wage earners of the new industrial cities, whom he termed the industrial proletariat. This class was bound, according to Marx, to act in a revolutionary way. History was working upon them so as to generate revolutionary capacity and mentality. It would present them with conditions to which revolution was the only logical outcome, and that revolution would be, by those conditions, guaranteed success. What mattered was not that capitalism was morally wrong, but that it was already out of date and therefore historically doomed. Marx asserted that every society had a particular system of property rights and class relationships, and these accordingly shaped its particular political arrangements. Politics were bound to express economic forces. They would change as the particular organization of society changed under the influence of economic developments. And therefore, sooner or later, and Marx seems to have thought sooner, the revolution would sweep away capitalist society and its forms as capitalist society had already swept away feudal.